This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Mvemba Dizolele is the director of the Africa program at CSIS. We hear a lot in the news about U.S. foreign policy interests and challenges in certain regions, about Europe or about what's happening in Ukraine with regard to Russia, about U.S. competition with China. We talked to Mvemba about why Africa is and should be at the center of foreign policy conversations, about the importance of building relationships over time, about the positives and negatives of certain kinds of foreign aid, and about the very different political situations, communities, challenges, and opportunities he sees in regions and countries across the continent. We also talked to him about the situations and decisions that societies and policymakers in Africa may face when approached by the US, Russian, and Chinese interests, who may offer very different value propositions in terms of investment and in terms of values themselves. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information about how to join us, past episodes, and our upcoming live schedule, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Wednesday featuring Emily Brooks, who's a reporter at The Hill and who is very knowledgeable about what actually happens day to day in Congress. Our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison led the interview. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
How do you and CSIS approach tracking developments across this enormous and diverse continent? Is it even possible to get a grasp on everything that's going on?
The way we approach Africa, like you say, it's a big place. We like to joke in many other circles. They say Africa is a country, because on one level, the people just talk about Africa, like this big place, there's a blob of land out there. But for us, the way we approach it, we typically approach it by region, because it's much easier that way, and it actually makes more sense that way. So let's say talking about the Sahel, because those countries have a lot of similarities, even though they have differences, but they actually have a lot of similarities. A lot of the issues are the same, pretty much. Desertification, droughts, insurgency, all those issues that we know of. But if you take East Africa, it may be similar, right? Kenya, Tanzania, they may feeling the same type of thing. Uganda, same thing. If you go to the south, places like Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, a lot of similarities there. The West is the same, Central is the same. So we like to take Africa in smaller pieces, which are these regions that are described, even though we know, of course, that the average African country is just big. Very few countries in Africa will be described as small. So even when we handle these regions that I'm talking about, you're still dealing with huge countries. We can also take it in terms of sector, right? So if you're talking about oil countries, oil-producing countries, that is, then you start with narrowing it down, right? If you're talking about oil-producing countries or oil and gas-producing countries, then you end up with about 5 or 7 of those, right? You end up with Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea. You end up with places like Mozambique that is discovering its own oil now, or places like Angola and so on.
We look for clues as to the priorities of the administration through documents that are released, like the one that came out at the very beginning of the new Biden administration, which was the Interim National Security Review document. And so in this document, the incoming National Security Council laid out their priorities for the term. There's a quote that I found in this document where the NSC say, we have the deepest connection. We understand our connection is the deepest to the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Western Hemisphere. And I thought this was such a funny phrase because it seems like it's describing almost the entire world. So what's left? Really just Africa. Africa is almost the only part of the world that's not mentioned. So it really seems like Africa is relatively low on the list of priorities for this administration. And I'd love to hear from you, Mvemba, why you think that might be a mistake. What are they missing out on when they deprioritize Africa in this way?
Well, I think it's a big miss for a set of reasons. But before I get on those, I think I'd like to say why Africa is often put at the bottom of the totem pole. Africa actually should be right in the middle of everything, because today, when you consider all the contingencies that the world is grappling with, right? Whether we talk about climate change, whether we talk about transition to greener energy with our electric cars, Tesla and others, whether we're talking about going to Mars, whether we're talking about our cell phone and our laptops, and we talk about aging population in the Great North, meaning in Europe and places like the US. What do we have left that can save the world? It's actually Africa, because it's Africa where we have the big forests, right? One of the big forests that we're dealing with, the Congo forest, the equatorial forest that the world needs to offset the costs and the price that we're going to be paying for climate change. You talk about rivers, we're talking about droughts. Well, where are some of the biggest rivers in the world? You find in the Congo Basin, the Nile Delta, you go to the Horn of Africa, and so on. Then when we talk about minerals, again, I cannot insist on this, whether you're talking about tungsten and coltan, and you name the mineral of the month, you're going to find it in Africa. The youth, if you take the average, you take the median age in Germany, the median age in Germany is 49 years old. In the US is 38. China says about 37. If you go to Africa, the median age of an African is 19. That means Africa is the continent of the future. As Europe continue to age, it will only make sense that they start tapping into these demographics, these young demographics that we have in Africa. So I think we need to turn this kind of policies and strategy on its head and say, what are we missing? Just as you're asking. And I think we're missing this just because of tradition that has made it that we always look to Asia or we always look to Europe. But I think we're missing out.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here, Mvemba, and ask a question about a country, large power China, that really, I think, probably sees a lot of potential in Africa for a lot of the reasons that you just listed off. And they had made this big push through the Belt and Road Initiative to have a lot of these massive investments. Yet lately, it seems like they have been curtailing the amount of money that they want to put into the continent. And I was wondering, why is that? Do you think that China's perception of the continent is drastically shifting? But I'm curious what your analysis of BRI investments tailing off on the continent and what's causing that.
So China has been engaged in Africa for a long time, long before China became rich. Right? Throughout the 70s, the 50s, actually, the 60s, to the independence movement, when they were exporting their political ideology, standing by the Africans as they fought for independence. And then through the 70s, they start kind of rising financially. They continue investing. So they know a lot of the leadership in many of these African countries. They've been there. They were just not as powerful as they became in the 80s, the 90s, and now. So the richer they become, the more they push into the continent with the Belt and Road Initiative and many other projects, but also asserting their own power on the world stage. So they engage people. They brought in a different option for Africans. You don't have to choose between the Americans and European and the Russians only. You can also choose between for us. And this is what we're offering you. If you were an African leader is in country X, and the West was always on your back, asking you about democracy this, democracy that, and then really not giving you a lot of financial packages to develop your own country, it was very tempting to go with the Chinese. So countries rushed to the Chinese with the deals they were offering. But then I think then there was a stop. People start saying, well, some of these deals are not particularly the best for us. And we're going to start asking more deals or better deals. And I think that caught the Chinese a little bit by surprise, but I doubt that they knew probably this will come sooner or later. And so the magnitude of some of the projects starts scaling down. I can take an example, for instance, in the DRC, because of the mines and other projects. China had entered into a barter deal with the DRC, $9 billion, where they said, we're going to build roads, we're going to build this, then you give us your mines and your cobalt and your coltan, we're just going to exchange. But since then, the Congolese have pushed back, the international community has pushed back. Now that deal is close to $6 billion and still going down. And the Congolese are asking to review the mining contract. We saw something similar in Tanzania. Tanzania has always been very close to the Chinese. The Chinese built the big railroad they call Tazara between Zambia and Tanzania. They were they were building a port. But when the late President Magufuli came to power, he wanted to renegotiate that stuff. And when they couldn't agree, he suspended that project. So Africans are pushing back, but you also have, early on I mentioned the young demographics. African youth are not on board with all these kind of deals that are mortgaging their future by giving so much to the Chinese. So there's always a risk of one day seeing young African leaders coming to power and saying we're going to nationalize or we're going to review this contract. And that the Chinese are aware of that, so the Chinese themselves are scaling back. They're actually considering a lot of public-private partnerships in their own way, where this project will be joint ventures between country X and China, not reducing those models that they had in the past. We're going to give you just tons of money, and if you default, we give you some more. We kind of hold you by the neck. But that's also, I think, the Chinese are noticing that is not sustainable in the long run.
So how should the U.S. approach strengthening ties with countries like the DRC, Kenya, and other large producers? Is it through easing trade relations, or is there something else that would be a top priority if you were in this administration to push strengthening ties with the countries that have a lot of the resources and can benefit the U.S. and the West in the future?
I'll say one is the mindset, right? When we started this conversation, you talked about where Africa stood in that strategy document. So that's already the place to start. Start looking at Africa, not like a dark continent that we're still going to discover. This is a document that has been there as long as the world has existed, and it's been home to humanity. So let's look at it for that. This is a continent like any other place. Now let's see the people who live here, they have resources. How do we deal with them? Well, we deal with them by trading with them. So putting in place policies that will make sense on both sides of the Atlantic divide, engaging with those countries, meeting them where they are. These are people in a lot of these countries who have talent. They have a lot of creativity. We see this through their music. We see this through many things that Africans are producing. So let's put policies in place, one that recognize these countries as real partners, not looking at them through the eyes of the Chinese. B, increasing our level of engagement. So you mentioned the Millennium Challenge Corporation. That account was really important, still important, but I think we need to scale that up. We are in the time of the pandemic now. We look at Africa like this crazy place, but Africa is actually home to a lot of knowledge when it comes to health, for instance. Africans have been dealing with pandemics and epidemics for a long time. So the average African doctor out there knows a lot more about the pandemic than somebody sitting at Georgetown or somewhere in Wyoming or in Utah. They just don't deal with those. So they have the knowledge. We may have the technology in the West. Let's start building win-win arrangements so that we can use some of these skills paired with the technology we have in the West and then get the world rolling. That's one area, right? Let's start building plants over there. Let's go beyond, coding. Now what we hear often is the Secretary of State went to Africa and he visited the Innovation Hub. It's great to visit Innovation Hub. But for a country, for a continent that is over 1 billion people and going on 2 billion in a number of years now, we need to be investing more. So we need to stake, by we, I mean the United States, need to stake his flag there and say, we're going to be here and we're going to invest here and we're going to work with the people. And it starts with the mindset. And then we have to put our money where our mouth is, because democracy is what people want. If you ask the African if you ask the African, the Chinese model, all these various models that we have there, Indian, Pakistan, Japan, all the stuff, people in Africa still like the US value proposition, right? The US says it's a lot of problems, social problems, but the value proposition of good governance, the value proposition of freedom, those kind of things, that's something that naturally the Africans also want, because those are natural yearnings of human beings.
The U.S. and many European countries have continued to isolate Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, but many African nations have remained neutral. What are some of the reasons the majority of African countries would want to stay neutral in condemning Russia?
Thousands of miles from Ukraine's battlefield, Mvemba Belem is frying bean cakes. The war has wreaked havoc on global commodities markets. And for 35-year-old Belem, that's meant the price of palm oil, one of her biggest business costs, has skyrocketed.
The market has become expensive. We can't buy oil. It's really become difficult.
Palm oil is ubiquitous in African cooking. The tropical commodity is not produced in Russia or Ukraine. Belem's predicament is an illustration of how shockwaves have rippled through an intricately interconnected global economy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine effectively removed a huge share of sunflower oil exports. The two countries account for more than half of global supply.
So, Mvemba, we've been talking about the lack of diplomatic equity that the U.S. have been building with African partners. And this suddenly becomes apparent when the U.S. are looking for something from African states. And that's been the case in the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. did seem to succeed in getting many African states to vote for the UN resolution. However, there does not seem to be the same level of enthusiasm in Africa to join in sanctions against Russia. Clearly, this is the result of, to some extent, this lack of equity, diplomatic equity that we're talking about. But given where we stand right now, how would you evaluate the success or lack thereof of this initiative? How well do you think the U.S. are doing at reaching out to African countries to get cooperation in this effort to isolate Russia?
I think for this particular initiative to isolate Russia, it will be very tough for the US, because it's all about credit, right? We all build credit in life. I'm on your show today. I'm building credit with you. Next time when I come knocking on the door, I was like, you should consider speaking about African issue X or Y. We have a relationship that will make it so that you consider it. I think a lot of African countries have close relationship with Russia, at least from the old Soviet Union days. Leaders were educated in Russia. And then after the end of the Cold War, Russia stood with some of these countries in different ways. They have their own relationship. But most equally importantly, on the military and security side, Russia has been working closely with some of these African countries. Places like the Angola, for instance, the Central African Republic, Mozambique, and you name it. They also bring this technology, nuclear power technology, that they've been exporting to different countries. And last but not least, on those big buckets, is food, my friend, food. Between Russia and Ukraine, those two countries supply actually most of the African countries with their wheat, with their soy oil, with a lot of food stuff. So that is still ongoing, right? So if you look at like a place like Egypt, even though it's North Africa, but Egypt is a full member of the African Union. Egypt is really gets all its food from wheat, either from Ukraine or Russia, from both countries. So if you ask a country like Egypt, or you ask a country like Nigeria or another country and say, now we want you to do this so that the Russians will behave. Well, what you asking them, like, are you ready to stop the shipment from Russia to come and bring you wheat in your country? So it becomes very complicated. How do we have more diplomatic relationship then? That's key, because you don't build a relationship the day you want to sanction somebody. You build a relationship 30 years behind. That's when you start developing this, 50 years back. And we see that doesn't work very well in cases like this, right? So if you take a country like South Africa, when they fought apartheid, well, the US for a long time was not on the right side of that history. The US was on the side that we not supported the apartheid regime. So the people in power in South Africa, they still remember that, right? And if the US comes and says, now we want you to do this, and they're like, you want us to do what? This is our friend. So this is the challenge we have. So that diplomatic equity is a work of long haul, right? Long commitment. One weakness we often have in US diplomacy is we like to do start and spurts and then stop and then start again. So if Justin is our friend and Justin start behaving a certain way, it's easy for the US to say, we don't want to deal with you again until you behave. And then we stop dealing with Justin. And then by the time we come back, we've lost a lot of time. Right? The Chinese don't do that stuff. The Russian, they continue dealing with you through thick and thin. And that goes a long way. By the time you get your act together, hopefully you get your country X get its act together. I think we lose track of that in the US. We sometimes get so caught up in our values and we think the world should just embrace them because we said so.
So I'm wondering, in the context of a declining wheat market from Russia and Ukraine, like you said, a lot of countries are dependent upon that wheat. Is there an opportunity that you're looking at for any specific or particular African country to use this increase in prices and this conflict to redouble on domestic production, reap the economic benefits, and maybe become a larger regional producer for the continent?
It's a bit challenging because I think Africans were caught off guard in many ways. And this is a wake-up call for the continent. The entire notion, several years ago, I was in Arusha in Tanzania at a summit. And former president of Nigeria at the time, Obasanjo, was there. And he was talking about how foreign aid works and how sometimes it can be very detrimental to certain recipients. And it gave the example of wheat. He said, we are Africans. We eat sorghum, we eat millet, we eat maize, corn, and many other grains. He said, when we start having a lot of troubles, the West came around and brought us wheat. He said, some of us didn't like this idea of wheat because in parts, it's not really what we grow here. And then people start, acquiring the taste of wheat. Next thing you know, they want more wheat. Next thing you know, they're not really paying attention to their sorghum and millets and other grains that they grow. So eventually we created this dependency on this product that's actually foreign product. And by foreign, I mean they're just not from the region. So the neglect of some of these traditional homegrown, staples became problematic over time. And now the war in Ukraine is brought at home. So to go to your question, are there countries that could double effort? They are. I think a country like Zimbabwe could do this. Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of that part of Africa. The DRC, if they were to get their act together, I'm sure there are a couple other countries after that are missing. But the challenge is a lot of these countries are in bad shape. Zimbabwe is in bad shape, in part because of the political system. The DRC is not the best of shape that it should be. So even if African countries decided they're going to change direction, which I think they should, and start focusing more on their own staples that they grow at home, it's going to take a while before they can get all those operations in line.
It's interesting to see that there are some countries, and one in particular, where Russia are really making inroads right at the same time that they're invading Ukraine. And the country that I'm thinking of is Mali. The Wagner mercenaries are now coming into Mali and really taking on the role that the French had been playing with the new Malinese junta, expelling the French and replacing them with these Wagner mercenaries from Russia. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and whether it gives us some idea of what to expect as Wagner is getting involved in Mali?
Thank you. So this is another one of those diplomatic equity that we were talking about earlier, right? So both of those countries, Mali and the Central African Republic, are former French colonies. In other words, these are places that if the world was monopoly, these are real estate that the French held for a long time. And I've been to Bangui. If you go to Bangui, when you land at the airport, you always wonder what happened here. Because there's no infrastructure to speak of, really. And you say this country has been independent for since 1960. What have the French been doing here? What did they do when they were here? In the Central African Republic, the joke when I was there was that the president is not really the president. He's the mayor of Bangui, which is the capital, because he couldn't get outside the city, even if he wanted to see the rest of the country. So eventually, I mean, the bad relationship between those government and France created an opportunity for the Russians. The Russians were not there before. And this is the opportunity that they seized on to come in. And Mali is the same thing. Yeah. So France was the power in Mali. Nobody could do anything in Mali without the green light of the French. But I think gradually the French antagonize a lot of the Malians. These are historical issues. And that led to the event that you just described. I think the French had threatened to leave Mali, and I think they were pretty sure that the Malian would say, please stay, don't leave. But this was a new generation of officers, right? The young officers, they said, fine, you can just leave. And that caught the French by surprise. And of course, they say you can just leave because they figure they have another option, just like the guys in Central African Republic. So to me, I would say the Wagner Group is exploiting the opportunities that they have, just like any other businesses. I mean, if we think this business of death, private military corporation, rather, is still a type of business, right? They generate profit. They're exploiting the weaknesses that they find. They were in Mozambique too. But they're also rekindling old relationships that Russia had built over the years.
We are familiar with the IDEA reports, the Global State of Democracy reports, and these are showing that for each of the last 5 years, the world has been turning away from democracy. And this includes the US. The US was a country that lost points on this index in recent years. But in Africa, we're seeing this very much reflected with this recent wave of coups. And we've seen in 5 different countries in the last several months military coups. One is in Burkina Faso, Chad. We talked about Mali, which have had multiple coups in the last few months. There's also Guinea, Conakry, and Sudan. So, Mvemba, do you see this as a trend? I mean, most of the countries are in West Africa, the countries that we're looking at. Do you think that this is really a wave, or are these more isolated incidents? And if it is a wave, what do you think is behind it?
It's interesting because I would not necessarily equate those with democracy. I think this is a transition, and those countries that have had their coups have had them the different contexts, right? So I believe the case of democracy is still strong in Africa. I think, like I said earlier, Africans still like that proposition. Data show this. If we look at Afrobarometer, the surveys after surveys show that Africans want good governance, they want transparent system of governance, they want democracy, they want to say, they want to have elections. I think what we've struggled with in Africa and in other parts of the world is democracy, as we've come to define it, is just not delivering for the people, right? Even in a rich country like the US, people are complaining that the social contract is not really being upheld in the way that the people expectation would like it to be, right? We have people who don't have access to medicine. We have people who don't have COVID has shown us that quite a bit in a place like the US. In a place like Africa, I think it's manifests itself differently in a lot of these countries. You have governments that have not been responsive to people. You have the failure of the social contract that unfortunately has caused conflict, right? In a place like Burkina Faso, in a place like Mali, Chad, this is a question when your social contract fails, people die. Yeah, people die because there's extremism, because there's insurgency, and then insurgency is exploiting exactly those fault lines that came about because the leadership did not deliver what they promised the people. So democracy, what we call democracy, at least that process, let's say if we take elections are not particularly, people are voting more, but they're not seeing results, right? So eventually people are saying, this system doesn't have to work, it's not working for us. And if we talk about those coups, that's also very interesting because if we remember in a place like Mali, when people like Captain Sonogo and those guys start staging the coups, some of these coups were actually not even intended to be coups. The soldiers were up front there, up north, fighting the Tuareg insurgency and this insurgent that had come from Libya and Algeria and other places. But they were not being paid, right? They were not getting the money. I serve in the US Marine Corps. I expect my officers and the politician to deliver when I'm at the front line, right? They don't want to deliver peace. I have to fight, whatever. But soldiers expect that our leaders in the back in Washington will take care of us when they send us in harm's way. In a lot of these countries, that's not what was happening in places like Mali. So you had soldiers walking back into Bamako and say, where's the pay? Where's the equipment? The next thing they know, like, oh, we might just as well take over this place. It sounds comical, but a lot of this stuff happen. Yeah, we've seen coups like this in Sierra Leone and other places. Sudan also has something very unique that we've not seen in a lot of countries. In a lot of countries, when you have these protests, coups, or counter coups, the people typically support or fight against those are the urban population, right? People in the city, they mobilize, they do this. And then once they get quashed by the security forces, that's kind of the end of it. You don't see urban youth typically joining in this kind of process. In Sudan, you have everyone. You have the urban youth, you have the rural youth, which made it very difficult for the security services. You cannot go oppress everybody in the city and in the village. And then you have the middle class, right? The professional association. And I think that is a very potent mix in terms of bringing about change in the country. And the Sudanese have that. So it's just a question of time.
And another really promising case, a really kind of exciting success story for democracy, were the recent elections in Zambia, where in the run-up to the election, there was a lot of concern that we might not have a peaceful transfer of power. We saw that Zambia was one of these countries that was losing points in these indexes. And now we see how, even with this kind of concern, Lungu willingly stepped aside, let the opposition leader come in and become president. They saw a peaceful transfer of power, something that we didn't even see in the United States in our last election. So, those kinds of successes, and there's probably many more of them that you can offer to us as well, Mvemba.
Absolutely. So Zambia is one those proud moments that we celebrate on the continent. We salute the Zambian people because they really mobilize for change. But I think it's also a great story of a convergence of interests. The United States played a major role when things looked very dicey. The United States, through its charge in Zambia, was able to weigh in. The other European countries, like the European Union, that is, came through. And I think that's often what lacks in other situations. There's people may be fighting for change, and a Western nation may decide, yeah, it's not in the best interest. We prefer the other guy because of X, Y, Z. And that goes often very far in undermining the credibility of a country like the United States, because people do not forget.
So we want to make sure that we get some audience questions in here before we conclude the conversation. So we're going to go first to Census, and then we're going to go to Ben. And Ben lives in Burkina. So we're going to go to Census first.
Okay, thank you very much. And greetings, Mvemba. Great to meet you in this forum. I have, I think, about 3 questions. My first is listening to your discussion about Ukraine and the US requiring African support. From the political analytic point of view, what is happening in terms of pushing the US and the Western countries to use the same type of principle they are using in the Ukraine-Russia scenario? So we see how Putin is being squeezed at every level possible to stop him from continuing with the war. But yet we have governments in Africa that are very detrimental and destructive and committing genocides as well as crimes against humanity. Yet the US and the West are cuddling to them. They still have their foreign missions within those countries, in a way giving those governments legitimacy. That's my first question. My second is regarding the ICC. So recently there is a push to take Putin to the ICC. And while this push was happening, we suddenly saw that the case for the Darfur genocide finally started at the ICC. To some of us, we feel the only reason this was finally brought in light is to somehow show that there is some kind of equity, that we also care about you. And so we're finally shedding light on your case, even though what we're pushing for is really to get Putin into that seat. And lastly, we have scenarios where, looking at, for instance, South Sudan became a nation and went into another conflict. And within that conflict, death, the most horrible type of killings happened. And that is still continuing. And we find that within this process of it continuing, the government is now hiring law firms, international law firms, to start creating new narratives. Okay. But there is no pushback on that from policy firms like CSIS or anything like that. For instance, they recently hired the British firm run by partly by Stephen Kay and his team. They were the same team that supported Uhuru. They were the same team that supported London when London was taken to court because of their work in Sudan during the war. When you have citizens that can't go against such big actors, where do institutions like the CSIS come in? And how can they play a role to question this type of actions?
Okay, so these are all very interesting questions and very pertinent. I will say for the Ukraine and why that model is not being used everywhere else, I think we need to remember that countries have interests and they act based on the interests. The world of politics has many layers. I think one layer is the morality of it. We all want the world that will be just and will do things that everybody will agree on. We all supposedly on the same value set. But that's not how the world works. Yeah? The world has its value sets, which part of the world subscribes to, and then there may be part of the world that is not subscribing to. But then those value sets are typically defended or not based on the urgent interests of the actors or the countries at play. In this case, the interests of the West, meaning West Europe, NATO, are very clear, and they're going to act accordingly, and that's what's happening. The ICC, I'm not sure what's happening in the ICC, so I cannot really comment very much, but Africans have had a lot of issues with the ICC for a long time. We know that, and they don't think the ICC is serving them well. And it only can be used to chastise them or to threaten them. As far as South Sudan and London, organizations like London, other organizations, or especially mining companies, get in trouble left and right. At CSIS, we do not take position on one issue here, one issue there. We do analysis. Sometimes those issues seep into our analysis, sometimes they don't. So we produce research, we do analysis, we brief decision makers, we provide for platforms for people to bring the issues, so that with public event and so on, so those issues can be discussed as well. But I will not look to CSIS as an organization to take position on those issues, because CSIS just doesn't work that way. There are the groups like Human Rights Watch and other groups that are in that sphere that have very clear position that way.
That concludes today's conversation. Again, huge thanks to Mvemba Dizolele, to CSIS, to their audience for their questions, and most of all, to you for being here. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information about how to join us, past episodes, and our upcoming live schedule, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Wednesday featuring Emily Brooks, a reporter at The Hill, who's very knowledgeable about what actually goes on in Congress day to day. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, our co-founders, we hope to hear from you soon.